On the morning of November 6, 1793, a man sat in a chair in the conciergerie prison while an executioner cut his hair. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak. He sat perfectly still, pale but composed, and let them prepare him for death. The executioner cutting that hair was the same man who had beheaded Louis XVI 10 months earlier. But this prisoner was different. This prisoner had voted for Louis XVI's execution. This prisoner was the king's own cousin, and in a few hours he would climb the same scaffold and face the same blade, condemned by the same revolution he had helped start. His name was Louis-Philippe Joseph d'Orléans, but by 1793 he'd renamed himself Philippe Égalité, Philippe Equality. And his story is one of the most bizarre, pathetic, and darkly ironic tales to come out of the French Revolution. This wasn't some idealistic reformer who got swept up in events beyond his control. This was arguably the richest man in France, a royal prince who owned 12 palaces, who turned his Paris mansion into a revolutionary headquarters, who bankrolled pamphlets and protests and political agitators, who genuinely believed he could ride the revolution to power. And on the way to the guillotine, the tumbril stopped directly in front of his own palace. He had to sit there, bound and helpless, and look at the place where he'd once orchestrated the very movement that was now killing him. To understand how a prince of the blood ended up beheaded by a revolution he funded, you need to understand something about the Orléans family. For generations, the House of Orléans had been the junior branch of the Bourbon dynasty, always close to the throne, never quite on it. And they'd developed a habit that irritated the senior Bourbons to no end. They kept flirting with opposition movements, with reformers, with anyone who might destabilise the king. Philippe Égalité took this family tradition and pushed it further than anyone had ever dared. By the 1780s, he'd transformed his Paris residence, the Palais-Royal, into something unprecedented. The gardens were open to the public. Cafes and bookshops and gambling dens sprang up in the arcades. Censorship barely touched the place. It became a nerve centre for every form of political dissent, from moderate reformers to radical firebrands. And Philippe funded it all. Camille Desmoulins, who would help trigger the storming of the Bastille, Brissot, who would lead the Girondins, pamphleteers and agitators by the dozen. The Palais-Royal became a machine for generating revolutionary sentiment, and Philippe sat at its centre, playing the friend of the people, the enlightened prince who understood that change was coming. On July 12, 1789, 2 days before the Bastille fell, the call to arms that mobilised Paris went out from the gardens of the Palais-Royal. The crowds carried busts of two men through the streets, Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister, and Philippe d'Orléans. It must have seemed in that moment like his gamble was paying off. It wasn't. To understand Philippe Égalité, you need to understand that he was never a true believer. He was an opportunist, charming, pleasure-seeking, and obsessed with the idea that the Orléans family deserved more than the junior seat at the Bourbon table. Born in 1747 at the Château de Saint-Cloud, he inherited a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. His marriage to Marie-Adélaïde de Bourbon-Penthièvre, the richest heiress in France, only added to the pile. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who threw himself into every fashionable vice, gambling, drinking, women, while cultivating an image as a progressive, enlightened aristocrat. He genuinely believed he could have it both ways. He thought he could fund revolution while remaining untouched by it. He thought his money and his connections and his carefully cultivated popularity would protect him. And for a while it worked. When the Estates General met in 1789, Philippe made a dramatic gesture. As a prince of the blood, he had the right to sit with the nobility. Instead, he crossed over and joined the Third Estate, the commoners. The crowds loved it. Here was a royal who understood them. Here was a prince who cared about equality. He renounced his feudal hunting rights. He donated bread money during food shortages. He presented himself as everything the distant, out-of-touch Louis XVI wasn't. But here's what you need to understand about revolutionary politics. Once you start down that road, there's no stopping point. The revolution kept radicalizing, and Philippe kept following it, always one step behind, always trying to stay relevant, never realizing that the monster he'd helped create didn't care about his money or his famous name. In 1792, when the monarchy collapsed and the Republic was declared, Philippe made his most dramatic gesture yet. He formally renounced his Bourbon identity. He adopted a new name, Philippe Égalité, Philippe Equality. The Paris Commune officially approved it. It was supposed to prove once and for all that he was no longer a prince, that he was a citizen like any other. It didn't work. January 1793. The National Convention was voting on the fate of Louis XVI. Philippe sat in the convention as an elected deputy. He'd won a seat representing Paris, a testament to his popularity, or at least to the popularity he'd bought. And now he faced a decision that would define the rest of his short life. The deputies voted one by one. Each man had to stand and announce his verdict, guilty or not guilty, life imprisonment or death. When Philippe's turn came, the chamber fell silent. This wasn't just any deputy. This was the king's cousin, a fellow Bourbon, a man who shared Louis's blood. Philippe stood. He spoke clearly. Death. Not death with conditions. Not exile. Not life imprisonment. Death without reprieve or appeal. The chamber erupted. Even some of the most radical deputies were stunned. A Bourbon had just voted to execute a Bourbon. When Louis XVI, still alive in the Temple prison, was told about his cousin's vote, his response was recorded. "It really pains me to see that Monsieur d'Orléans, my kinsman, voted for my death." For Philippe, the vote was calculated. He thought it proved his revolutionary credentials beyond any doubt. He thought it would finally erase the taint of his royal blood. He thought the Jacobins would have to accept him now. He was catastrophically wrong. The royalists already hated him. They'd hated him since the 1780s, seeing him as a traitor to his class and his blood. Now, they called him a parricide, the grave digger of the monarchy. But the revolutionaries didn't trust him either. His wealth made them suspicious. His birth made them suspicious. His very existence reminded them that even in a republic, there were men who thought their names and their bloodlines entitled them to special consideration. Danton, who had himself faced the guillotine within a year, is reported to have spoken of Philippe with undisguised contempt. "This slime," he said, "makes me sick to my stomach." Philippe had voted for his cousin's death to prove his loyalty. Instead, he'd proven that he had no fixed principles at all, that he would do anything, sacrifice anyone to stay in the game. The revolution was about to show him what it did with players like that. By early 1793, Philippe was a man caught between two worlds, trusted by neither. Royalists saw him as the gravedigger of the monarchy. Revolutionaries saw him as a Bourbon pretending to be a citizen. He had no faction, no protectors, no base of support that couldn't be bought. And his money was running out. And then his son made everything worse. Philippe's eldest son was Louis Philippe, Duke of Chartres, the future King Louis Philippe I, though no one could have predicted that in 1793. In the spring of that year, young Louis Philippe was serving as an officer under General Dumouriez. Dumouriez was a complicated figure. He'd won famous victories for the Republic at Valmy and Jemappes. He was also growing alarmed at the radicalization in Paris, at the purges, the paranoia, the guillotine working overtime. In April 1793 he made his move. He tried to turn his army against the convention and march on Paris. It failed. Dumouriez fled to the Austrians, and Louis Philippe, Philippe Égalité's son, went with him. The young duke wrote afterward that he saw the convention utterly destroying France. He may have been right. But from the perspective of the Committee of Public Safety, his defection looked like treason. Worse, it looked like proof of an Orléans conspiracy. Proof that the whole family had been plotting against the Republic all along. On April 1st, 1793, the convention passed a decree allowing the arrest of any deputy against whom there were strong presumptions of complicity with the enemies of liberty. Philippe voted for it. He voted for the law that would be used to arrest him. 5 days later, on April 6th, 1793, the convention decreed the arrest of all Bourbons still on French soil. Philippe Égalité was specifically named. The warrant was served at the Palais-Royal. Philippe was dining with his friend de Monville, eating sole of all things. When the news came, Philippe reportedly cried out, "What ingratitude!" De Monville, according to the story, continued calmly squeezing lemon on his fish. "This," he said, "is what they are going to do with you." The next morning, soldiers dragged Philippe from his bed. The man who had orchestrated political movements from this very palace, who had entertained crowds and funded newspapers and imagined himself the people's prince, left it as a prisoner under guard. He wouldn't return. The arrest didn't stop with Philippe. His sister, the Duchess of Bourbon, was seized. His two younger sons, Montpensier and Beaujolais, were arrested. His daughter Marie Adélaïde was placed under house arrest. The entire Orléans family, every member the authorities could find, was swept up. Only Louis-Philippe escaped, but his escape only made things worse for everyone he'd left behind. The Orléans prisoners were transferred south, far from Paris and any potential supporters. Their destination was Fort Saint-Jean in Marseille, a coastal fortress that Louis XIV had built and that the Revolution had converted into a state prison. The journey itself was a humiliation. Crowds gathered along the route to jeer at the former prince. People who might once have taken his bread money or visited his gardens now shouted for his blood. In Marseille, Philippe entered a world of stone walls and narrow cells and uncertainty. He would spend roughly 6 months there, from April to late October 1793. While the revolution in Paris grew more extreme by the week, we don't have prison diaries or letters from Philippe during this period. What we have is an impression. A man who had lived in the most extravagant luxury imaginable, surrounded by servants and courtiers and admirers, now confined to a dark cell in the south of France, cut off from information, waiting to learn if he would live or die. He knew his eldest son had fled to the enemy. He knew that fact alone made his own position almost hopeless. Every week brought new rumours of executions in Paris. The Girondins, then the Dantonists, then whoever the Committee of Public Safety decided to target next. The man who had once imagined himself riding the revolution to power now sat in darkness, waiting for the revolution to decide what to do with him. Meanwhile, in Paris, the machinery of death was running at full speed. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established in March 1793, had become a factory for executions. Its public prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, had a simple job: turn suspicion into conviction, and suspicion was everywhere. The tribunal didn't operate like a normal court. There was no appeal. Sentences were carried out immediately, often the same day as the verdict, and the definition of counter-revolutionary kept expanding to include anyone the Committee of Public Safety wanted dead. The Girondins, the moderate revolutionary faction that Philippe had once associated with, were arrested in June and executed in October. 22 deputies went to the guillotine in a single day, October 31st, 1793. Philippe had been decreed accused along with them. His turn was coming. In late October or early November the orders came: transfer the prisoner to Paris. Philippe arrived at the conciergerie around November 2nd, 1793. He had been in prison for 7 months. He was about to discover that this prison was different. The conciergerie sat on the Île de la Cité, attached to the Palais de Justice, where the Revolutionary Tribunal held its sessions. It had earned a grim nickname, the antechamber of the guillotine. Prisoners here didn't wonder if they would be executed. They wondered when. The walk from cell to courtroom to tumbril was measured in hours. Some prisoners, the lucky ones, got days, many got less. The conditions were brutal. Vermin-infested cells, disease-killing prisoners before the tribunal could. Crowds of the condemned packed together, waiting for their names to be called. Marie Antoinette had been held here before her execution 3 weeks earlier. The Girondins had passed through on their way to the scaffold. Now Philippe joined them, another name on Fouquier-Tinville's list. The irony was perfect. Philippe had once presided over a semi-independent court at the Palais-Royal. He'd been the centre of a political universe, dispensing patronage and shaping opinion. Now he was one anonymous entry in the tribunal's death ledger. Philippe's trial began and ended on November the 6th, 1793, just days after the Girondins had been executed. The charges against him were politically loaded but legally thin. The indictment focused on his birth as a Bourbon prince, former Duke of Orléans, Prince of the Blood, his son's defection with Dumouriez, treated as evidence of a broader Orléans conspiracy, old accusations that he'd funded disturbances during the early revolution, the October days, the Women's March to Versailles, and maintained a factional court at the Palais-Royal. Vague claims that he'd conspired with Dumouriez, Lafayette and Mirabeau against the true revolution. The evidence was recycled speculation. There were no documents proving conspiracy, no witnesses to secret plots, just the fact of his blood and the fact of his son's treason. Philippe defended himself calmly. He pointed to his revolutionary record, opening the Palais-Royal, supporting the Third Estate, renouncing feudal rights, taking the name Égalité, and, above all, voting for Louis XVI's death. He denied knowing about Dumouriez's plans. He insisted he'd had no part in his son's decision to flee. He argued that his vote for the king's execution had broken the dynastic principle, that an Orleanist restoration made no sense when he himself had helped destroy the monarchy. The tribunal wasn't interested. According to accounts of the proceedings, when the inevitable guilty verdict was read, Philippe responded with bitter clarity. Since they were predetermined to put him to death, he said, they ought at least to have sought more plausible pretexts, because the world would never believe he was guilty of what they had declared. Then he made a request. Don't make me wait until tomorrow. Execute me now. They refused. He was returned to the conciergerie to spend one final night. There's a dispute in the historical record about what Philippe did that night. One version says he ordered a lavish final meal, oysters and ribs with Bordeaux wine, and went proudly to his death after feasting. Another version, based on different memoirs, says the revolution had already confiscated his entire fortune. He didn't have enough money to order the traditional last dinner. The richest man in France, once worth more than anyone could easily calculate, couldn't afford his final meal. What the sources agree on is that Philippe paid careful attention to his appearance. When the executioner's assistants came for him the next afternoon, they found him sitting calmly. His hair had been cut short, the standard preparation for the guillotine. His face was pale but composed. He showed no outward agitation, and he was dressed immaculately. The accounts describe a green frock coat, a white waistcoat, buckskin breeches, and carefully polished boots. His hair, what remained of it, was powdered in the old aristocratic fashion. Philippe Égalité, citizen of the Republic, enemy of tyranny, was going to die looking like a prince. Philippe wasn't being executed alone. The Revolutionary Tribunal routinely bundled prisoners together, a practice called amalgam that mixed unrelated defendants into single conspiracies. In the anteroom of the conciergerie, Philippe waited with several other condemned men. One was General Pierre Coustard, a former deputy. Another was a man identified in the records only as Monsieur de Larocque. When Larocque entered the room, Philippe had his back turned. But when Larocque recognised who else was waiting to die, his reaction was explosive. His face filled with indignation. And then he spoke, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I no longer regret life, since he who has destroyed my country receives the same punishment for his crimes. But I confess, Monseigneur, that I am deeply humiliated to be obliged to die on the same scaffold as you." The word Monseigneur, my lord, was deliberately cutting. It was the address due to a prince. Larocque was refusing to call Philippe citizen. He was throwing his royal identity back in his face, making clear that even at the threshold of death, even sharing a scaffold, he would not pretend that Philippe Égalité was anything other than a Bourbon who had betrayed his blood. Philippe said nothing. That silence tells you something. In his final hours, Philippe had no defence left. Not against royalists who saw him as a traitor, not against revolutionaries who saw him as a Bourbon, not against anyone. He'd made himself hated by everyone, and now he would die surrounded by that hatred. Around 4 in the afternoon on November 6, 1793, the execution convoy left the conciergerie. The condemned were loaded onto an open tumbril, the same kind of cart that had carried Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and thousands of others. The route wound through the streets of Paris toward the Place de la Révolution. Crowds lined the way, watching, shouting, jeering. Many of these people had once benefited from Philippe's largesse. They'd drunk in the cafes of the Palais-Royal. They'd read the pamphlets he'd funded. They'd cheered his name in the streets. Now they cheered for his death. The accounts say Philippe maintained his composure, but they also note something else, that his demeanour wasn't the exalted courage of someone like the Girondins, who'd sung revolutionary hymns on their way to the scaffold. Philippe's face showed something more like indifference, or disgust, or simple resignation. He watched Paris pass by with the expression of a man who had run out of calculations, and then the tumbril stopped. The officer in charge of the escort had ordered the cart to halt directly in front of the Palais-Royal, Philippe's palace, Philippe's headquarters, the place where he had entertained and conspired and imagined himself the coming man of French politics. It wasn't his anymore, of course. The revolution had confiscated it along with everything else he owned. The name had been changed to Palais-Égalité. Revolutionary slogans covered the façade. République une et indivisible. Philippe had to sit there, bound in the cart, and look at it. This is where the famous line appears in the sources, the line that may or may not be authentic. but that perfectly captures the black irony of his situation. As the crowds jeered, as the same Parisians who had once applauded his every gesture now screamed for his blood, Philippe is reported to have said, "Ils m'applaudirent." They applauded me. Did he actually say it? The line appears in 19th century compilations of famous last words, attributed to the moment when the cart stopped at the Palais-Royal. Like many reported last words, it rests on hearsay rather than documented transcripts. But it captures something true. Philippe had spent over a decade buying applause, literally paying for crowds, funding journalists, orchestrating his own popularity, and now the applause had turned to howls for his death, and these howls were authentic. They weren't paid for, they weren't orchestrated. For the first time in his political career, Philippe Égalité was hearing what people really thought of him. The Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, had seen so much blood by November 1793 that executions had become grimly routine. The guillotine stood on a raised wooden scaffold. Bodies were loaded onto wagons immediately after decapitation and carted off to nearby cemeteries. On busy days, dozens died in succession. Philippe climbed the steps. The accounts describe what happened next in almost clinical terms. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, the same man who had beheaded Louis XVI, or one of his assistants, moved to remove Philippe's boots. The boots needed to come off so the prisoner could be properly strapped to the bascule, the tilting plank that would position him under the blade. Philippe objected. "Tush, they will come off more easily afterwards. Let us be done. Let us make haste. Dépêchons-nous. Let's get on with it." One account adds that Philippe examined the blade with apparent curiosity before being strapped down. Another has him making a final request to the executioner. Make it quick. He gave no speech. He offered no final political declaration. He didn't pray, at least not out loud. He simply let them position him and waited for the end. The blade fell. An assistant lifted his head for the crowd to see as custom required. A great cheer rose from the square. One observer noted with acid precision that this may have been the first time Philippe's applause hadn't been paid for. He died at 46 years old, 10 months after his cousin the king had died on the same scaffold. Philippe's body was taken, like other guillotine victims, to the Cimetière de la Madeleine, a small cemetery in an affluent quarter that the revolution had converted into a dumping ground for the executed. The process was standard. The body went into a simple coffin. The coffin was placed in a deep pit. Quicklime was poured over it, layer after layer. More earth was added, the ground was tamped down. The quicklime was the key. It accelerated decomposition. It destroyed evidence. It made identification nearly impossible. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had been buried in the same cemetery, treated the same way. But after the Bourbon Restoration in 1815, the new regime made an effort to recover the royal remains. Guided by a royalist official who had secretly noted the burial sites, they exhumed the king and queen and reburied them with honours at Saint-Denis. No one looked for Philippe Égalité. His remains were never recovered. His bones remained somewhere in what is now the Square Louis XVI in Paris, mixed with the quicklime and the earth and the undifferentiated dead of the Terror. The revolution erased him as thoroughly as it erased his palaces and his titles and his carefully constructed image. The man who tried to buy equality ended up equal to everyone else in the mass graves of the revolution. Here's the question that hangs over Philippe's story. Was he a villain or a fool? The royalists thought he was a villain, a traitor who sold out his blood and his class for political advantage. They never forgave the Orléans family. When Philippe's son Louis-Philippe became king of the French in 1830, the legitimists called him the son of the regicide and used his father's vote to delegitimize the entire July monarchy. Some revolutionaries thought he was a villain too, a cynical aristocrat who tried to ride popular anger to power, funding radicalism as long as it served his interests and expecting his money to protect him when it didn't. But others saw him as something more pathetic, a man who genuinely believed he could control forces far larger than himself, who thought his wealth and his name and his carefully cultivated image of enlightened aristocracy would carry him through any crisis, who kept making increasingly desperate gestures, renouncing his titles, changing his name, voting for his cousin's death, and couldn't understand why none of it worked. The revolution didn't care about his money, it didn't care about his votes, it didn't care about his name change or his renounced privileges or any of the calculations he'd made. The revolution cared about blood, and Philippe Égalité was a Bourbon. That fact was written into his bones, and no amount of political manoeuvring could erase it. Philippe's death didn't end the story of his house. His eldest son, the one who fled with Dumouriez, survived the revolution by wandering in exile through Europe and eventually America. In 1830, when France overthrew the last Bourbon king, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans returned and became king of the French. But his father's ghost followed him. The Legitimists never stopped calling him the son of the regicide. Foreign courts treated him with suspicion. The stigma of Philippe Égalité's vote, of a Bourbon who had sent a Bourbon to death, clung to the family for generations. In 1848, Louis-Philippe was himself overthrown. He died in exile in England, the last king of France. The Orléans gamble, the family strategy of flirting with opposition, of positioning themselves as alternatives to the senior line, had finally played out. They'd gotten the throne, held it for 18 years and lost it forever. And it all went back to Philippe Égalité sitting in the National Convention in January 1793, standing up to vote and saying the word that would haunt his family: death. Philippe Égalité tried to weaponize equality. He thought he could fund a revolution and ride it to power. He thought his money could buy him safety, and his name could buy him relevance, and his votes could buy him trust. The revolution took his money first, then it took his palaces, then it took his name, and on November the 6th, 1793, it took his head. And that line he may or may not have spoken, looking at the Palais-Royal for the last time, hearing the screams of a crowd that had once cheered on his command: "Ils m'applaudirent. They applauded me." It's a fitting epitaph for a man who spent his life buying applause and discovered too late what real popular judgment sounded like.